Welcome to Comforted Growth, the podcast for people who are passionate about personal growth and productivity. Today, we are here with our resident guest expert, Dr. Greg, my husband, my founder, my best friend, my confidant. I can't say my therapist because that would be unethical, right, Greg?
Let's talk about that in a bit.
I have my own therapist, but you have always been, Greg, such a great inspiration. And today we're going to try to not make it a workshop-y kind of thing, because when Greg and I get into the room, the danger is that we can start like getting into teacher mode, right?
Oh, I end up doing therapy with you.
Unauthorized therapy. Yeah, but what I want to hear from you today is your answers to some of our community's burning questions, because therapy is something that a lot of people are therapy curious, but they don't necessarily know how to start with it.
Sure.
And I want to have like a super casual chat. By no means should you take this as some kind of like complete guide to therapy or something like that. It's just casual sharing of our experiences, like me as a person who has been for a lot of therapy, been through a lot of therapy, and you, Greg, as somebody who has been a prof, has been, somebody who taught psychology and somebody who is a practitioner and also somebody who goes for therapy.
Absolutely. But maybe it's a good starting point by you sharing a little bit what brought you into therapy as a client.
I actually went reluctantly. I didn't think that I had an issue at all.
Most people don't.
Most people don't. So what happened was that I was, in a previous relationship.
Previous life.
In my previous life, right? When I found out 7 years into my marriage that my ex-husband was having an affair. So it was something that really shocked me. And at that point of time, I was completely devastated. I had two little ones. I had my eldest was 1.5 years old. And then I literally had a newborn when I found out. And it was one of those times where everything just came crashing down. I, didn't know what to do. It felt like, for the first time in my life, I really did not know what the solution was. And I spoke to a few of my banker friends, and they were all recommending me this thing called the Hoffman process, which you know about, and I've spoken about in our earlier podcast as well. It is a in-depth 7-day residential personal growth retreat, and it is facilitated by psychotherapists. Yeah, and that was my first experience of psychotherapy and how powerful it could be. It was quite interesting because when I was on this retreat, I went more of like a companion to my ex-husband. So the two of us went for this retreat together. But I went in with this attitude like, I don't need this. This is more for you. And, I'm really high functioning. I'm a high performer. I'm a high flyer. There's nothing wrong with my life. When I was at that retreat, everyone was sharing about stuff. And they seem to be sharing about like their own childhood traumas and, the setbacks and the challenges in life. And I remember being super judgy. Like when these people were sharing, they might say like, oh, my mom, she used to blah, blah, blah. And I was like, please lah, my mom even worse. Or like they would be sharing like, oh, I had this terrible challenge. I'm like, seriously? In my mind, I was being like, that is nothing. And then after a while, I realized that actually there was a lot of stuff that had happened in my life. And as I was speaking to Volker, whom you know, who was my therapist and my facilitator at the Hoffman process, he pointed out that I had quite a traumatic childhood in many ways, which I never actually thought was the case. I always thought that this is just a normal Asian childhood and one shouldn't dwell too much about like unhappy things or like, it actually trains you to be resilient. So like, what's the big deal sort of thing. One of the wake up calls for me was when I did this quiz, which you might be aware of, called the ACE quiz, the Adverse Childhood Experiences quiz. So it's a quiz where there's 10 questions. And on a scale of, you tick off how many of these 10 questions you can relate to, and then you get
experienced them in your childhood.
Yeah, have you experienced these in your childhood? And there are things like, have you ever been like, beaten, caned, that sort of thing? And, have you ever had somebody that, shamed you or whatever it was? And in this quiz, if you get a score of 4 or higher, you can go to like Harvard's Developing Child Psychology website and look at all the research. Granted, it's a rudimentary test. And it doesn't take into account like the positive resources that people have. It doesn't mean just because you have a higher score that you'll necessarily be traumatized. But
It puts you at risk.
Yeah, it puts you at risk. So in this ACE quiz, if you have a score of 4 or more, you are significantly higher at risk for poor health outcomes in life and all kinds of pretty negative
It's like physical health, mental health, social relationships, really everything, your success in life.
Absolutely. And let me just say my score was significantly above 4. So that was when I realized that, oh, maybe I should get some professional help in trying to give me some resources on, how to improve my mental health.
Yeah.
And one thing that I learned recently was that in 2019, researchers came up with another quiz called the PCE quiz.
Okay.
So the ACE quiz is adverse childhood, which is like negative childhood
All the
experiences,
stuff
right?
that could have gone wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. But they found out that actually there were, I think it's 7 PCEs, which is positive childhood experiences. And the more of these out of 7, the more likely you were to be protected from, negative mental health outcomes and, physical health outcomes as well.
Yeah, and how did you score on that?
Yeah, I actually scored pretty high on that, which is why I think that even though I had a pretty challenging childhood, I also had lots of resources. For example, I was popular at school. I had at least 2 non-parent adults who showed an interest in me. And, for instance, I had pretty good social support system.
It was a safe environment in Singapore.
Yeah.
You're pretty smart. You had good schooling.
Yes.
Like resources were provided for you.
Yeah, but definitely, coming back to therapy, I learned through the Hoffman process that there were many different ways of making sense of the world. I realized that all along I've been interpreting the world and events that happened to me through a very crystal lens. I had no idea that there were so many different ways of looking at the world.
Right.
And actually, it was only through the process of therapy that I learned how to start questioning my narrative. So it's like, let's say something happens, like somebody at work, interrupts me, or somebody, looks at me a certain way, or somebody doesn't invite me out for a certain event. And, in my head, I'd be very quick to tell myself a story, as I'm sure a lot of people do. But it was only through therapy that I learned to question my own narrative and not be so sure about how I see the world, and like also give me tools on how to cope with like stress, negativity, and doing certain compulsive things. Like, I have a diagnosis of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, OCD. That's a mouthful, but essentially it means...
Psychologists like the jargon. So.
Yeah. But essentially it means, as you know, that when I get stressed out, I tend to become a little obsessive compulsive. So I tend to do certain things over and over again. And it was like only through understanding myself that, through a therapist, that I realized that some parts of this wasn't normal. Yeah.
Yeah, so in a way, like going to the Hoffman process gave you like a way of zooming out and re-examining how you've come about to be the person that you are, your behavioral patterns, some of those compulsions or obsessive behaviors.
Yeah, but we also don't know like what is normal, right?
Yeah, so like you don't know if you don't know.
I mean, but also like a lot of people, we just like talk with our friends about stuff, and then you get like well-intentioned advice from your friends, but a lot of times your friends won't tell you like that's not normal.
Yeah, but they also may not understand the extent of the severity of any of these issues.
Exactly.
Or
like
what's going on in people's minds, basically.
Yeah, like for example, if I tell my friend, oh, I'm having like disturbing thoughts, your friend might be like, yeah, everyone has that, right? But a psychologist or a psychotherapist would be able to actually do a like assessment, like how disturbing are these thoughts? Are we talking?
How frequent are they?
Yeah.
What's the nature of the thoughts? Is it like just like, oh, I hate Monday mornings? It's like a disturbing thought, but that's very qualitatively different from, I want to kill everybody around me. Disturbing thoughts.
Yes, absolutely. So I think like having therapy also gives you a like very objective perspective from somebody who is really for you and is unbiased and is just like a great resource for you. So Greg, what inspired you to become a therapist?
What inspired me? I don't know. We should go into the questions.
Yes. Tell me about your journey to therapy.
Well, I guess I've always been more of a people person, so curious about, how people live their lives, how they think about certain issues. how they problem solve, how emotions work. So curious about the human species as a whole. And then, of course, coming up to university, I was like, I'm wondering what should I study? What courses are relevant to understanding human beings? I was like, okay, should I become a teacher? Should I become a social worker? Should I become a sociologist? So like really kind of the social sciences. But when I ended up with psychology in first year, I just became fascinated by everything, the neuroscience, the cognitive science, the clinical psychology element. And I knew that was really for me and that I wanted to become a clinician as well, helping people with emotional challenges. So
one thing that's really weird about Greg is that, we wear these Oura rings, right? These are like fitness trackers.
Yeah, not sponsored.
Yeah, not sponsored at all. But like they do
they're great.
Our fitness trackers, the Oura rings, they actually have this function where they monitor like how stressed out you are. Okay, so get this. Whenever I'm doing a session, like if I'm doing like coaching or
Coaching.
Greg calls what I do scotching because it's
you've termed that.
Yeah, that's true. Because it's not pure coaching, it's actually scolding people. A lot of my clients just come to me because they want to be scolded.
Yes.
So I tell them I am
is.
not a coach. Please don't call me a coach. I very rarely use coaching methodology. I oftentimes combine it with mentoring, with scolding, with all kinds of
reality check.
Reality check, provocation, and everything, right? Yeah, but anyway, coming to that, when I have where was I? When I have a session, oftentimes my heart rate spikes, right? And I go into like the highly engaged / stress zone.
/ overfunctioning.
But Greg, every single time he has a therapy session, he goes into this deep Zen stage, right, Greg?
Being fully present with my client. But also, I mean, maybe some people are going to ask later on, well, what's therapy really all about? In my perspective, it's about empowering the client for him or her to do their work and their journey. So it's not for me to do the work for them.
Yeah, I think that's why you're such a great therapist. So that brings me to the first question from our community. Greg,
Okay.
Are you ready?
I am ready.
So the first,
and thanks for the questions.
So the first question is the evergreen. What is the difference between a coach, a therapist, a psychologist, a mentor? I want to give my own definition. It's highly unscientific and unofficial, and then you can tell me. You can tell me, okay?
Okay, I'll be taking notes.
Okay.
On how you do.
So the first one, mentor. Let's do mentor first. I think mentor is quite a loose, informal kind of relationship. Normally, mentors are unpaid. You don't have like some kind of contract, like confidentiality, expectation. You don't sign anything. Money doesn't change hands and so forth. And what's interesting about a mentor is that a mentor has to have relevant life experience. So they're normally somebody like, say, from your industry who has been around the block, has had years of experience. They have some sort of wisdom, some sort of experience, life experience. And so they can impart advice, they can share with you what they went through.
Experience. I might have a mentor or psychologist who has a lot of expertise in doing psychotherapy.
But they have experience, they have expertise, right? And also for a mentoring relationship, oftentimes they can inspire you, they can motivate you. They do tend to do a lot of sharing. Like, when I was going through this thing, let me tell you a story about how blah, 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 right? Or sometimes they might give you like their opinion or something.
Totally.
Yeah. Sometimes they could even open doors for you. So they might open up their little black book of connections and say, oh, you know what? You should meet this person. Let me introduce you to somebody in this field or this sector. Whereas a therapist or a coach, that would not be the case, right?
Yeah.
That would be crossing a boundary.
It's much more a professional relationship.
Yes. So coming to coaching now.
First of all, I think full marks on defining a mentor. Well done.
Thank you, Greg.
You're welcome.
So secondly, coaching. Now, a coach does not need to have any sort of life experience, domain expertise at all.
It's good to have life experience.
Yes, Greg, thank you. Yes, they must have the experience of being an adult. You know what I mean is that a coach doesn't need to have relevant domain expertise.
Correct.
Like if I am a banker, my coach can be somebody that knows nothing about banking.
Yes.
For example, if I'm a real estate agent, my coach can be somebody who doesn't even know anything about real estate, right?
But they're good at asking coaching questions.
Yes. You stole my line.
Sorry.
So a coach, normally their value is that they're very good at asking powerful questions. Really, that's what coaching is.
Yep.
Asking powerful questions so that you hold the question, consider the question, reflect on their questions, and then come up with the answers yourself.
Yep.
So coaches are not regulated. Anybody can call themselves a coach. Normally, most people look for a ICF, International Coaching Federation registered coach.
Yeah.
And we've both gone through that training as well.
And it gets more confusing because there's life coaches and health coaches and nutrition coaches and executive coaches
leadership
and
coaches,
relationship coaches and
performance coaches,
astrology coaches and how to train your pet coach.
Yes, absolutely. So coaching is kind of a sector that is pretty broad. Normally people see an executive coach or a life coach or some kind of like career coach because they have a specific issue.
Yes.
I find that, therapists, psychologists, counselors tend to delve more on the past. They're qualified to be able to go into the past.
Sure.
Yes, whereas coaches aren't really qualified to ask you to unpack trauma from your childhood or how you were grown up, and all those limiting beliefs that had formed, etc. Sure. Whereas I find that when I speak to a therapist, the focus of psychologist, therapist, counseling is very much about my emotional well-being, my mental health.
Yep.
And it's also quite deep work in that I find that we spend quite a lot of time going into the past. Generally, all of them have pretty rigorous training as compared to coaches.
Yeah.
Greg, why don't you tell me the difference between a counselor, a psychotherapist, and a psychologist, clinical psych?
Well, I think we also should throw psychiatrists into the mix because that's a big question. So that's also an easy one to answer. So psychiatrists are medical doctors who specialize in psychiatry.
So they have to be GPs first, lah?
They have to go through medical school.
Yes.
So every psychiatrist has an MD.
Yes.
And they're obviously trained more in the physiology and biology of illnesses, and mental illnesses is their focus and the treatment of mental illnesses. So it's more on the severe end, your depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, ADHD, and the primary focus of treatment is through medication.
Yeah.
Some of them obviously curious about the mind and emotions and therapy, but sessions tend to be much shorter, maybe 15-20 minutes, usually involving review of medication, and then that's it. So that's psychiatrists. Medical doctors, most of the treatment is through medication. Now we're moving into the mental health realm, and what we have are counselors, we have psychotherapists, and we have clinical psychologists.
Yes. Greg, I'm thoroughly confused already.
Yes, I've also confused
Are
myself.
you also confused yourself?
Yes. Okay.
So imagine how confusing it is for everyone.
Yes, it is. And it's very frustrating. Okay, here are the basics again. Okay, so counselor could be shorter courses.
Yes.
Or easiest route of entry. Doesn't have to have a psychology undergrad, but it could be diploma, degree, and a master's level.
Okay.
Working with people with less severe mental health challenges or your average life emotional ups and downs.
Okay.
Yes.
And then we go into psychotherapy/psychology.
Yes. You can do a master's in counseling psychology, which is similar to a counselor, but they have a much more in-depth understanding of psychology and 3 or 4 years undergrad.
But what's the difference between a psychotherapist and psychologist and a counselor? Is it like psychologist or psychotherapist is like more atas? Is it like more high class? Or like what is it?
It is often a reflection of more in-depth study.
More in-depth study.
Yes. So a psychotherapist usually has an undergrad degree in psychology, probably at least a master's in general counseling, for example, or clinical psychology, and then does further 1, 2, 3 years in-depth training.
So they study longer lah.
Yeah, forever lah, in a certain type of psychotherapy. Yes?
Okay, so if I have something like a more severe challenge or like a more complex case, then I should go and see a psychotherapist or a psychologist.
Counseling psychologist.
Counseling
yes.
psychologist. Then we have clinical psychologist,
Yes.
which you are.
Yes.
Clinical. So what does this
Yes.
clinical mean?
Well, clinical implies traditionally that you're working with more serious clinical disorders.
Yes.
Which is similar to the psychiatrist, your serious depression, bipolar,
Yes. Abnormal psych.
schizophrenia.
Yeah.
Yes. And maybe in a clinical setting in a hospital.
Yeah. You worked in hospitals before, right?
Yes.
All over the world.
Yes.
Yes.
So meaning the clients or patients come in with much more complex presentations, much more severe emotions.
What presentations like PowerPoint?
We call it presenting issues. Problems lah.
Yes.
First of all, yes, you need to have undergrad in psychology. Nowadays, it's a minimum master's, so 2 years qualification in clinical psychology. But
Yes.
most countries actually have moved to a PhD. So it's either another 3 years of doctoral training
So
on top
you
of the
study
master's.
even longer.
Yes.
So
Sometimes
basically,
8, 9, or 10 years.
yeah, because you studied for nearly 10 years,
Yeah,
didn't you?
Yeah, quite some time. Gray hair la. Okay, but it also means they're quite expert in a number of other domains that counselors or psychologists may not do. For
Like what?
example, assessment of mental health conditions.
Yeah.
So they use various questionnaires like your childhood adversity survey to really assess, does the person have attention deficit disorder or not? Do they really meet criteria for depressive disorder? Do they require referral to a psychiatrist? So the very thorough assessment phase, or could be intelligence tests as well. Only clinical psychologists are actually entitled, or educational psychologists, to do such a thing.
All right. I think we're there. Are we? Is that it?
Kind of, yeah.
Like, would you recommend that people go and see like 2 or 3?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where I agree with you. That's a little bit like dating. One of the main factors that will impact how successful therapy is and whether it will really help you is the relationship that you have with your therapist.
Yes.
So you need to be able to trust them. You need to like their style, whether they are more, a little bit more informal or very formal or very directive or non-directive. Like really seeing, does their style of work and their personality work with you?
Yes.
And that may take also a little bit of time. So I would say give it 2 or 3 sessions. And also the first session usually is a big download, like really getting to know you as a client first, who you are, where you're from, what's going on, what have you tried. Very little coming back perhaps from the therapist. Whereas
Yes.
in session 2 or 3, when you know what the problem is, they may start sharing a lot more about or giving advice or using certain techniques.
Yes. Okay. So I have specific quick questions from the community. Are you ready, Greggy?
Sure.
All right. I would love to know if therapy or other sources have helped you and your partner navigating conflicts. What do you do when you feel frustrated at their bad sides? You can answer this as a person.
You don't have a bad side.
How do you think therapy has helped you deal with like our issues?
Well, I think therapy has been tremendously helpful, helping me figure out who I am, how my emotions work, how to self-soothe and manage my own stress, difficult emotions.
So if like we're having an argument and then you go off and you talk to your therapist about it, like what do you think is the most helpful part?
Well, I think it's more the things I've learned in therapy about how to manage my emotions. For example, how to notice in my mind I might be having an amygdala hijack and just making you out to be the worst horrible person ever, and then 10 minutes later after going for a little walk, all that's gone, but I didn't act on that.
Yes.
And bought into it that you are really this horrible monster that's out to get me.
When I'm cross at you, sorry for interrupting, Greggy. When I'm cross at you and I tell Volker about it, my therapist, he's always able to come up with like some kind of interesting perspective, like, oh, I think that you're angry about Greg, yawning, for example, because that reminds you of like when you were young and you used to blah, 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 and then your dad used to do that and it made you feel like dismissed. So like he's able to draw some connection between like why I'm getting so upset. And it's normally not about you. Yeah. It's normally about some kind of old wound or some kind of old baggage that happened before. Yeah, totally. And then after that, we'll have a good laugh about it, Volker and myself, and I'll feel a lot lighter. Yeah, but I mean, like there's so many ways of processing, right? Yeah. For me, just knowing that I have this little date with Volker and I can go for a walk and talk to him and get things off my chest, and he's like so for me, he's my special person. That in itself to me is like super valuable. My 16-year-old has self-acknowledged gaming and screen addiction. I'm wondering whether it will lead to ADHD-like consequences like poor executive function, time blindness, lack of motivation. Would you be in a position to say whether a therapist, a clinical psychologist, psychiatrist, or counselor would be the best professional?
It sounds pretty complex and maybe requiring a proper assessment. So I would say clinical psychologist.
Yeah, because then they can assess how.
But sometimes it may also be that he or she may have ADHD already, and that's leading to computer gaming. And sometimes like the chicken and egg to figure out, well, what comes first, and that needs to be treated, and then the behavior may resolve itself.
Greg, do you still see clinical patients for therapy?
Just a few, because I'm very busy.
Okay. How do you heal from workplace trauma? I feel like I'm broken from this.
Well, we don't know what the trauma was, but it sounds quite serious. I would suggest, go and speak to a mental health professional.
Okay, one more. Last one.
Yes.
Hi, I want to
Hi.
ask about therapy for my child. Post-divorce, my 9-year-old girl randomly expresses full-blown anger and craves her father's attention. She found out about her father's new relationship on her own. How do you help? You're gonna say see a therapist. I can see it.
Well, I think not only do you may benefit from going to a therapist as your child, also I think would be good to see a child psychologist. There's clearly some processing required. There's clearly anger involved, and kids also, if they don't get help at an early age, can develop many more serious problems later on.
I think you bring up a really good point, because even if you can't make the ex-husband go for therapy, you can always do therapy. And as a parent, your child's well-being really literally depends on how well adjusted and how calm and how stable and how mature you are.
Yeah.
So I always recommend that, whatever happens, I can control me. So I can do the therapy. So sometimes you can send your child for therapy and for clinical assessment, but I think it's also important that you be able to do the work, because, after all, you are the person that spends the most time around them and you need the most amount of resources.
And really good to figure out, is this just part of normal growing up as kids and difficult years and moving into teenage years where emotional outbursts are quite common?
Yes.
Or is it, as you said again, more worthy of an intervention that's guided by a psychologist?
Okay, last thing I want to talk about. People have asked, what's kind of therapy should I go for? EMDR, should I go for TRE? Should I go CBT? There's all these acronyms,
Word soup, yes.
all this word soup. So I'll share a few that I've tried before. Okay, so one of the most popular ones is called CBT, Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. Greg, short version, what is this?
I mean, if we go back in history, psychotherapy as a discipline
No, not the
started
history,
off once upon a time.
Yes.
Well, it's more modern type of therapy that's
Yes.
more in the here and now, focusing on practical steps to help to change your behaviors, your emotions, and your ways of looking at things.
Maybe we should do it this way. I will tell you my layperson's impression of psychotherapy, the feel of it, and then you can tell me what I got wrong, okay?
Okay.
So my impression is that long time ago, psychotherapy is like people like Sigmund Freud,
Yes.
who's all about analyzing your mother issues, your father issues, and
Yes.
how they shaped you and sort of
Yes.
that kind of stuff. And then we've got Carl Jung, who was very much about dreams and symbols, right? And then after that whole wave of psychotherapy, if you will.
These were the founding fathers of therapy.
Yes.
About 150 years ago. Yes.
That's where the jokes are lie on the couch and cry about your mother.
Talk about your dreams, phallic symbols, all of that.
Yeah, but then that we have more modern schools of psychotherapy, which are things like CBT, for example. So cognitive behavioral therapy, to me, is very much about teaching you tools
Yes.
on how to think in a much more balanced way. So to help you with any negative thinking habits that you might have,
Yes.
and learn how to reframe certain limiting beliefs or negative thoughts. That's
the C part of cognitive behavior therapy. I mean, there's also just cognitive therapy, which is just that.
Yes.
The behavioral part is also learning different ways of behaving or taking care of yourself or breaking old behavioral patterns that are also unhelpful.
So I might use CBT, for instance, if I want something that's very practical, let's say I want to get over binge eating.
Yeah, I mean, CBT is one of the most researched and most modern form of therapy that's actually been shown to be very effective for depression and anxiety and low self-esteem. So it's a very established research form of therapy.
Yeah, so of course there's CBT, which is one of the most popular now. Some psychologists are also mindfulness trained. So they might teach you mindfulness techniques for soothing yourself.
Yeah.
And then, of course, if you have trauma, then there's various types of therapy like EMDR or TRE, which I'll post in the show notes below that you can check out. But really, when you see a clinical psychologist or therapist, they should be able to recommend to you which ones are the appropriate types of therapy.
Yeah, totally.
Yes. And with that, we've answered all your questions so far. Most of them, we hope. If you have any more questions, send them to us. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Comfort and Growth, the podcast for people who are passionate about psychology, psychotherapy, counseling, mentoring, coaching, personal growth, and productivity.
Yeah, so don't hold yourself back. Give it a try and be curious how it can help you perhaps on your journey.
See you. Bye.
Bye.